Charlie, let's talk a little bit about Catholic social teaching, and especially the cornerstone of it all, that is the dignity of the human person and the rights that human beings have. This is, I think, can be shown to be a keystone for the teaching during the last 100 years, which we usually associate with Rerum Novarum, 1891, issued by Pope Leo XIII, one of the great popes in the history of the Catholic Church, a long reign, and someone who was very intellectual himself and brought the church into engagement with the modern world. And we might just sketch out a little a background of that, because when you start talking about human rights, I mean, there's a sort of feeling, well, the church has always been for human rights or human dignity, but as a matter of fact, the church has been very leery of that in the modern world, because to go back to the French Revolution was a major event in the self-understanding of the Catholic community, and it really was a fearful kind of event. That this French Revolution was taking people in a bad direction, and all this talk of freedom and equality and so on, that this was would undercut the faith. That as soon as you gave that much freedom to people, and then everyone had their own rights and to worship as they wanted and to think as they wanted, that the church's authority and position would be undercut, and that people would drop away from the faith. So, I mean, I think that's a fundamental background to this whole question of human rights, and why through then much of the 19th century you get this tremendous opposition to it, epitomized in the 1860s by the famous Syllabus of Errors by Pope Pius IX, where he castigated all the freedoms. I mean, whether it was freedom of press or whatever, he was against it. And that made the church look really bad in the modern world, and everyone said, well, that's why the church is out of it. I mean, they're not for freedom. If you're not for freedom and human rights, how can you be even a partner in the dialogue about shaping the modern world? That's what sets the stage for this tremendous impact that Leo XIII made by saying, no, we're going to talk about a right here, one right to organize into unions. And it begins to shift now, and the church begins to slowly rethink its position on human rights.
And in a way, at that point, and especially as you outline that context, Jim, Leo XIII was to some extent being what he was proclaimed to be by a lot of Europe, namely a revolutionary. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, while the church certainly shared that long history with civil structure in Europe, especially of an established, structured, organized social order in which, all institutions had their understood place, from one perspective, certainly to talk about individual liberties and freedoms and rights would very accurately be seen as terribly threatening to that established structure. And yet for the church especially, and it strikes me out of what fundamentally for the church is a theological basis that says that human beings are of tremendous importance precisely because of creation and redemption. That the whole focus of the church's own identity is to deal with those created and redeemed by a God who became one of us, and you cannot work out of that theological framework without eventually coming to where Leo came to. So I'm sure there were some people in the church who, when Rerum Novarum came out, kind of breathed a quiet theological, finally we're back home.
Yes, back home, well put. It's a very interesting dynamic, isn't it, Charlie? The way there's certain ideals set up in the scriptures and in the Christian tradition that we lose sight of, but they remain a powerful force to come back and challenge us once again. Now, there's nothing really more fundamental in the scriptures than this idea that we have dignity and worth. Right in the opening chapters of Genesis, it says, we're made in the image and the likeness of God. The fathers of the church love to play with those phrases, image and likeness. We already possess God within us. We have the divine sparks within us, and part of our whole task in life is to be faithful to that. But that's what gives us our importance. God put us here to tend the garden, to take care of the earth. And then you use two important phrases, I think. Creation, that's the whole, the basis. As created realities, we have worth and dignity, and that's why we can't just look down upon poor people. That's why we can't. Why older people have retain their worth. That's why we speak out for the unborn. all of those things based on this dignity of the human person. But the second thing you said was in terms of the redemption, which I think is important too, the incarnation, that Christ became one of us, that he walked this earth, knew our joys and sorrows, was fully human, like us in all things except sin. And so we see right away that now the dignity is even enhanced. God becomes one of us. And then we would go on to say, well, Christ died for us. He sacrificed himself for us. And as he walked this earth, he treated people with dignity. So now we got a twofold reason for thinking we're valuable. We're part of creation, but we've also been redeemed by Jesus Christ.
I suspect there are probably more parallels than we're conscious of, too, between the way in which, in this last 100 years, there's been a more explicit addressing of some of those social concerns, and also in our scriptural and liturgical and theological growth as a community, a comfortableness in addressing the dimension of the humanity of Jesus that simply wasn't there 50 years ago or 100 years ago. It was, well, yes, he's truly God and truly man, but it was really about 99 to 1, and the 99 was the God side.
Yeah, right.
And it's almost as though as we become more at ease with an awareness and understanding that yes, he was human like us, then to look at all those things which affect human beings becomes more consistent with being faithful to the gospel, and the more we do that, the more perhaps we get a handle on Jesus' own humanity. So that I think that plays back and forth.
One part that I think has helped us, I think there's other parts that fit into this turnaround in the Catholic thinking as well. One is the whole experience in the United States. That is, our revolution is far different from the French Revolution in many ways. So the European revolutions have generally led to secularization, to people leaving the church. And that's been the general trend. But in the United States, our revolution didn't do that, although many predicted it would. The sociologists often predicted that secularization would take over in our country also, but not so. So here's a country in which the church has freedom, and everybody else has freedom to practice their religion, and so we have our Bill of Rights and the First Amendment guaranteeing freedom of religion and the expression of it, and the church flourishes. People don't quit going to church, they go in greater numbers. So we got 90% of the people say they believe in God, over 90%, and I think it's 82% pray regularly, and a high percentage of people belong to churches and so on. So we remain a religious country despite, or we would probably say maybe because of, our experience with freedom, that the church has flourished in a free situation. Now that general experience has sort of tugged on the edge of the church's consciousness now, I think, through the 19th and 20th century. It's been a battle within the mind of leaders in Rome, I mean, whether they're going to take more seriously the American Revolution and experience or the French Revolution and the European experience. I think generally, all the way up to the Second Vatican Council, they were still dominated by the French Revolution and the secularization problem in Europe, and the fear that if you were too open on this most fundamental of rights, that is religious liberty, that we would lose members in the church.
I think it well illustrates a point that one of our Ohio bishops, Bishop Malone from Youngstown, who used to be president of the Conference of Bishops, made in a talk here in Toledo some years ago, and he was pointing out how critical it is for the church in each of the locations around the world, and he was speaking specifically to the U.S. experience, to faithfully and regularly and consistently interpret back to Rome the experience of the life of the church in this culture and in this place. That to automatically expect those in a position of administration or something in the Roman Curia to understand what it's like to be a religious person in America is crazy. They're not a religious person in America. We are, and the experience has to be interpreted back. And so that it is precisely people exercising and living in and flourishing in a recognition of those freedoms that have to, in effect, keep sort of telling the Home Office, this really works. You know, and it really works to the benefit, not to the detriment of the church.
You know, the figure we associate with that, of course, is John Courtney Murray, the great American Catholic theologian, most influential one we've produced, made the cover of Time magazine and so on, and a great architect of the religious liberty document in Vatican II. And some commentators have pointed out, while we don't usually list the religious liberty document as part of Catholic social teaching, that it has tremendous social ramifications, because it takes this most primary right, the freedom to worship, well, I don't know if I want to carry most primary, but I mean, a fundamental human right to worship, and plays it up and brings it into the Catholic thought and says, well, we don't have to fear freedom of worship, that we want people to be free, that it was a way of taking the American experience of liberty and bringing it into the consciousness of the whole church through this magnificent document on religious liberty, a real breakthrough. John Courtney Murray deserves credit for keeping that idea alive even when the popes still throughout the 20th century were leery of it and taking another viewpoint. And, well, we got to bring in another figure, but I'd let you comment on that first.
Well, certainly Murray and is someone well known within Catholic theological circles, and yet I suspect if you asked the average Catholic in the pew who John Courtney Murray was, you'd get sort of a blank look, and the tremendous contribution that in that case, one man with a clear vision who consistently and clearly was able to keep spelling it out, not terribly, I don't think, seen historically as a controversial figure in the sense of embroiled in all sorts of public battle, but one who saw clearly enough that dimension of the gospel and the truth of it, and kind of a witness to the fact that if you keep speaking the truth firmly enough and loudly enough, eventually it's heard.
Yes, and arguing it well. That's, of course, was his idea, to have civil discourse, and you can't have civil discourse unless people are engaged in argument. You have to have fundamental things that hold you together, that you have in common, in this case the gospel, the example of Jesus, the notions of creation and redemption that you brought up, and that within that framework you can begin to look at cultures, and you can do empirical analyses of look how it works in the United States, and our First Amendment is an Articles of Peace in a sense. It's a way that doesn't set up secularism at all, as people thought, but it sets up a condition where the various religions can continue to live their life and indeed flourish. So I think he was able to bring that experience into the life of the church. The other person I had in mind was, of course, Pope John the 23rd, who really, did speak so much about this human rights issue. I go back just a little more history, Charlie, which I think is instructive, and that is 1948, the Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, a document written by one of our more prominent Catholic philosophers, theologian types, Jacques Maritain, commonly thought of as a neo-Thomist, took the thinking of Aquinas from the 13th century very seriously, tried to open it up to modern thought, and was very taken by what we call personalism. So he thought that we were in danger of being too individualistic. Let's not talk about the individual so much, but let's talk about the communal person. He talked about a communitarian individualism. But he based that in sort of a natural law understanding of human beings through creation having worth and dignity, and therefore having rights. In other words, he brought the two things together. We got dignity. Because we have dignity, we have rights. Now let's spell those out. And of course, the United Nations Declaration really did a marvelous job of that, of spelling out social and civic kind of rights, and also economic rights. Maybe that's one reason the United States has never ratified that, because it talks so much about economic rights.
I think also we are very used to, in this country at least it seems to me, looking at rights in terms of the concept that rights are given you by law or by some kind of external authority structure. A concept of rights that flow internally, from one's own dignity as a person, is one that I think we have to struggle with a bit. I think once we get into exploring that, it's a sense of, it fits, that if I am worth something, then the right to protect my own worth, for starters, the right to enhance that, to grow and develop in it. But it's a little different tack from a sense, and we come at so much of especially what is controversial in our society in terms of using a legalistic matrix to work that out. We take matters to court. We say, well, what does the law say, as though that were the only source of rights, and if the law doesn't specifically give you some rights, you don't have any. And the very personalist orientation of that approach, whether it be Maritain, whether it be, I think, certainly the core of what the gospel is trying to say, is that rights flow from who you are, not from what the social structures give you from the outside.
Right, and a very important idea, and of course that's embedded in our American understanding, isn't it?
Inalienable rights.
We have those rights from God, and that was one of the major points of the Founding Fathers, that the state does not give these rights, that indeed they come from the higher power, and that's what then justifies them or grounds them. It gives it a basis that some particular politician, government official cannot take away from you. And therefore, I think in that sense, the American experiment is in tune with some of our most fundamental religious, theological positions. And maybe one of the reasons we would want to be optimistic about our system, because right at its root, it's got one thing exactly right. And that fits in with the Catholic social teaching that distinguishes the state from society as well. There's always in Catholic social teaching the idea of keep the state in perspective, the word state representing the government aspect of this. But society in Catholic social teaching has always been broadened. That's all of us.
Inclusive.
And all of us have these rights then from God, these unalienable rights that really cannot be taken away from us.
You alluded a moment ago, Jim, to the fact that those rights in some ways fall into a couple of rather broad categories, one being political and the other being economic rights. And certainly I think, again, the history of the American community is to have developed extensively our sense of the dimension of political rights. Certainly in current years, the whole civil rights movement, for instance, the fact that we take for granted the right to vote, the right of free speech, the right of public assembly. In a lot of ways, some of those were some of the core issues around which the revolution was fought. It's kind of a given in our society, and I say that in contrast to some other societies in the world where it's not a given, where the right to vote is something that is battled for and clung to rather tenaciously, and maybe that's why they have 70-80% voter turnouts and we have 40 or 50 at times. But the minute that we move over into economic rights, maybe because they have more of a social dimension to them, maybe because they immediately get into the issue of property and possessions, we're a little less definitive sometimes and certain on how we want to talk about rights in the field of economic rights.
Yes, well, in fact, it creates a sharp division. I mean, there's really strong argumentation right within the Catholic community of saying that you can't talk about economic rights, that those two words don't go together. And you had Michael Novak arguing that strenuously in relationship to the bishop's pastoral letter. Michael Novak being a Catholic layman and a philosopher works with the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. And so Michael and many others saying, no, you cannot equate civil rights like the right to vote with economic rights like the right to have a job. Now, that's a very large debate, and I'm not sure we're going to really solve that at a philosophical level. But what we can say is that in Catholic social teaching, they have lumped together human rights, civil rights, and these economic rights. And where we find it, I think, most clearly spelled out is in the great social encyclical by Pope John the 23rd, Peace on Earth. That was issued in 1963, that was right during the time of the Second Vatican Council, as you remember, even before the religious liberty document was passed, by the way, which was debated throughout the council and was a late addition to the whole production of documents there. Now, I want to just, Charlie, go through some of these rights that the Pope talks about, and to give a feel for how wide they are in scope and the kind of things that he's interested in. So he talks about a right to life and worthy standards of living, including rights to proper development of life and to basic security. Right to basic security. Rights of cultural and moral values, including freedom to search for and express opinions, freedom of information, the right to education. Now, boy, I mean, there you're getting it. Rights to religion and conscience. There's the religious liberty thing. The Pope has often set the stage for what eventually happened in the council, so that it was his council even after he died, in many ways, died after he issued this encyclical in 1963. Then there is the rights to choose one's state in life, including rights to establish a family and pursue a religious vocation. Now, that's one that in some parts of the world, you wouldn't really see lived out too much. Then in the listing I'm looking at, he talks about economic rights, including a right to work, to a just and sufficient wage, a traditional point in Catholic social teaching, and to hold private property, another traditional one all the way back to Leo XIII. Just a few more of these to complete it. Rights of meeting and association, big thing in our whole understanding of things. Right to emigrate and immigrate. Political rights, including right to participate in public affairs, that would be the voting and so on. Now, to get back to your fundamental distinction between civil rights and economic rights, what this points out, it seems to me, is the Pope brings them together under human rights, and he says, indeed, that economic rights are part of the whole package. Now, again, there's a lot of reluctance to accept that. I must say the bishops in their pastoral letter on the economy did indeed opt for economic rights as well. So people do have a right to a job.
Strikes me as I hear you say that, Jim, that sometimes even how our terminology does it. I think if you ask the typical American citizen, how do you feel? Do people have a right to this, a right to this? They're going to say, oh, what do you mean a right? But when you say, do you think that when somebody says, gee, I think I should have a shot at a job so I can support myself and my family. I think I should have at least some kind of a shot at decent medical care. Do you think that those desires or aspirations are basically realistic, legitimate, that you're not asking for the moon? I think most people would say, well, yeah, sure.
The problem, that's well put, the problem with economic rights is what the opposition will say is if there's a right, then there's an obligation to meet it. So if you can say, like, you got a right to vote, then the government has an obligation to set it up so you can vote.
Right.
That's very clear correlation. There's rights and then there's duties on the part of whoever is in charge to make sure that those are kept. When you look at economic rights, what they don't say, if you say that you got a right to a job, everyone's got a right to a job, the question comes back, who is going to do that?
Precisely.
And their fear is that the answer comes back, government. Government's got to give the jobs. Now we got a total welfare system, and we got what they call statism, and a system that, flies in the face of the free market. And that, I think, that really, my reading of it, after all the philosophical jargon and dispute has gotten through, it seems to me that's what runs and motivates this whole thing of saying, let's not talk about economic rights.
And I think that if you read the whole body of Catholic social documents that have come out, some of the extremely rigid critiques of those kind of totalitarian systems, whether they be extreme forms of socialism, whether it be Soviet communism, some of the documents it's ironic that actually the origins of the American bishops' document on economic justice was an earlier document that the bishops had done in terms of a critique of the communist system, and someone said, well, gee, we ought to critique the other side, and that's where the dialogue ended up. But the sense that if the core issue, and as you say, it's maritime, it's traditional Catholic theological thought, if the core of the issue is the dignity of the individual person, then it seems to me you also have built into the argument precisely the counterbalance to any trend to go to a collectivist, statist, hyper-socialist kind of thing that destroys that very individual freedom and dignity, which Catholic thought would say is at the very heart of the matter.
Many people said that the bishop's economics pastoral really was sort of a warmed-over Great Society approach of Lyndon Johnson and so on. And I think that the reason that is not true fundamentally is that the bishop's answer to the question, if you got a right to a job, whose obligation is it to provide it? Their answer is not the state at all. The answer is society.
And that
society as a whole. That is, the whole of us living in solidarity have an obligation to make sure that all the people can participate in the life of the country. I think that is the fundamental answer. Again, I'm stripping away much of the really difficult argumentation, but I believe that that's their answer to it. Society has an obligation. That means all of us. That then suggests the answer is partnership. Bring together business and labor to try to work on this. Bring in the government. Bring in the state government, the local government. Bring in church organizations, volunteer groups. All of us have an obligation then to help create an economy in which everyone can have a job, in which everyone can do productive work.
Which would also accord with the whole concept of the principle of subsidiarity, which says that basically government, on the one hand, could not and should not get involved in doing this as a government thing if other structures and coalitions and alliances of groups and organizations in society can do it. But it does say that it is precisely the function of government to step in and address situations where there is a recognized common need in the whole society, and if other mechanisms or other levels are not able to address it or cannot adequately address it, then there may be a role for government to step in and to play a part of that. Maybe government is simply the convener of the parties who provide the solution, though, rather than the solution provider. So to say that the government becomes involved does not mean that the government resolves the issue.
Right, exactly. I really think if we're going to defend our Catholic social teaching here in the United States, we have to make those points strongly, because we have such a strong feel for our economic system, for the free market, and so on. But I do think that the human rights as given to us by Pope John the 23rd, necessarily include the economic dimension. It's not that he just brought it in, but as soon as, I think you said it very well, as soon as you got dignity, then that dignity extends to all aspects of your life, and that has to be respected. I might just want to make a final point here about the Church sort of has reversed on all this now. Instead of being against human rights throughout 19th and 20th century, we have been the great promoter of human rights. Look at how well the Church has done in Poland in getting people civic rights, and helpful in Czechoslovakia and in the whole Eastern European revolution. So the Church has done a 180 on this thing. Instead of looking like it's blocking progress, it's really been a force for liberation and for rights.
And it's ironic that the Polish labor organizations and solidarity, having the Church publicly supporting solidarity specifically and generically, is a place that I think a lot of Catholics feel is exactly where their church should be.
Right, and then we become happier with the whole situation. Well, Charlie, we've been talking here about Catholic social teaching, focusing on human dignity and human rights, and the thrust of our conversation has been to bring the two together. Let's say the rights flow out of the dignity of the person. The Church was late coming into the whole struggle here, often seen as an opponent, but with Leo XIII we started to reverse that, seen championing the rights of working people, and then we moved throughout the 20th century and we hit a high water mark in Pope John the 23rd, who lists all these rights, economic and civil, and then we see the United States where we flourish because of it. And now maybe that great understanding gets extended to a larger part of the world, and we can sort of be proud of our Church as furthering this human project.